Welcome. Good to see such a high turnout this evening. Welcome everybody. Welcome to everybody here in the aula of the Academiegebouw, and also welcome to people that stayed at home and are watching the live stream. Welcome to you as well. Still a few people coming in. Take a seat, please. Here at the front there's also some spaces. It's not scary. You can just sit here. Welcome everyone. My name is Els Aerts and I work as a program maker for Studium Generale, which is the platform of Utrecht University that organizes free public events where scientists talk about societal topics. And this evening is one of the series Beyond Capitalism, which we co-organize with the project Visions for the Future. And they aim to analyze alternative socio-economic systems. And in this evening we will talk about one of those alternatives for the future, which is different from neoliberalist capitalism, which is fascism. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Before we dive into this topic of fascism, I wanted to talk with you about a little bit more uplifting subject, which is, so I work for Studium Generale, and we are actually celebrating our anniversary this year and also this month. So we've been existing for 80 years now. Whoa! Applaus for Studium Generale. And the reason that I am talking about this now is that this 80 years is not a coincidence. Because Studium Generale was founded shortly after the end of World War II. So on May 5th, 1945, the German troops signed the surrender and the Netherlands were free. And along with this sense of relief, the liberation also brought up an uncomfortable question. How could it have come this far? Intellectuals, too, had to look in the mirror and ask themselves whether they should have done more to prevent the rise of Nazism and fascism. Not everyone embraced the Nazi ideas, but most did not actively oppose them either. To prevent this ignorance from repeating itself, greater social engagement on the part of universities was needed, and that is why, in 1946, Dutch and German ministers instructed their universities to establish the Studia Generalia, the plural form. The goal was to make students and scholars resilient against totalitarian ideologies by offering them a broad academic education and instilling a strong sense of social responsibility. So that's what me and my colleagues are working very hard for every day. So now I would like to know from you, like, are you, as an audience, are you resilient against fascism? What do you think? Okay, that was a bit unclear. Okay, you can repeat me, okay? Yes, we are resilient. Maybe still some work to do here. So that's why today here we are discussing the rise of fascism again, and answer the question, or try to, is history repeating itself or can we resist? So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. He's an Argentine historian working at the New School for Social Research in New York. And the topics he researches are fascism, populism, the dirty war in Argentina, the Holocaust, Jewish history in Latin America and Europe. He also wrote 8 books, and most of them are about the topic of fascism, such as From Fascism to Populism in History, a brief history of fascist lies, and one about transatlantic fascism, if I'm correct. And his most recent one is called Wannabe, Fascists. And his books have been translated into many languages as well. So we are very happy to have him here on our stage in Utrecht. So he will tell his story. Then he will be followed by another speaker, which I will introduce to you after his story. And she will give a reflection in addition to what he has been telling us. So please, a very warm applause for Dr. Federico Finchelstein.
It works? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So I'm extremely happy to be here, my first time in Utrecht. I think time number 3 in the Netherlands. And I would like, to thank Professor Robin and Dr. Hannah McHugh for having invited me for this program. It is, I'm, again, like as always in my life, as a person that works on the history of fascism, dictatorships, and so on. I'm very happy to be here, but the topic is not that happy. And the question is why, one of the questions that I ask myself is why someone like me who specializes, I'm, particular enough to be interested in things that I don't like. And that's what I study: racism, dictatorships, fascism, Nazism, and other forms of violence, brutalization, victimization. And, and that's me. But the question is why these things are, worrying enough that rather than being a topic of specialization is a question that we are all asking ourselves. So I ask these questions not only as a scholar of these things, but rather also as a citizen who is extremely worried about what's going on. So today with you, and then in dialogue first with Dr. McHugh and then with you, we will talk about why this is happening, whether this was something that happened before, i.e. Hitler, Mussolini, etc., and what can we do about it? So these are the questions that we will be talking about today. For the people that are, students or maybe, students in the audience, I would say that you are in a very different situation to the situation I was when I started as a scholar of fascism. Because at that time, and I'm from Argentina, and I live the first years of my life under a gruesome dictatorship that was quite influenced by global and national variants of fascism. But then, when I was 9 years old, they were done, and democracy, emerged in my country. And so basically, it's true, to be sure, that when I was in high school, basically they were, the people from the past, they wanted to come back, very literally so. They attempted a couple of coups d'etats with tanks on the streets and so on, but they were defeated. And by the 1990s, when I entered the university now as a history student at a public university, the University of Buenos Aires, it was clear that basically the things that interested me and worried me about, I guess about political norms, tolerance, and democracy, I wouldn't have put it that way, but that was a concern, expressed in different ways, belong to the recent past. So in that sense, it was always, we historians, we study, this is, I think, an answer that almost every historian will give. We are not interested in the past per se. We don't collect things from the past. We are not antiquarians, but we are interested in the past because we are interested in the present. And in fact, at different times and different periods in history, historians, we ask questions to the past. There are concerns that we have in the present. I guess, for example, when under Bush, there was the second Bush, the second Iraq War, people in the field in the US, where I was doing my graduate studies, they were interested in the history of empires. So there were a lot of research on the history of empires. Why? Because there were questions about the US empire now, which is, of course, something similar is happening today. I'm sure all over the world, people being more interested than in the past in studying authoritarianism, fascism, and dictatorship because they are concerned about the present. But when people like me of my generation that started, studying fascism more than 30 years ago, 30, we were concerned about the present, but less so than now. So I'm not jealous about being a student, and being a student of these issues right now, because the concerns are directly related to the present, not to the recent past. And of course, big concerns about the future, which is also the topic that we will be talking about. Now, the question then that I'm asking myself almost every day, and maybe you're asking yourself that question, is how new is what we are witnessing and we are living, and maybe we are even suffering for it. How new is this? Is this a turning point in history, or is just a return of the old fascism of the 1930s and 40s? Or maybe totally unconnected to a new era or to the past, and this is more of the same. So depending on how you answer this question, maybe you are very worried or not as worried. I will say that I am in the group that is very worried, and I will explain why. Now, as an historian, or many historians, we ask this question of what is new, and we try to answer it historically. That is to say, by going to the past and trying to understand what connects us to that past. Not only what is similar or structurally convergent or present similarities, but also what connects us to that past. Of course, never a shy person or a humble one, President Donald Trump, the leader of the US, said a couple of years ago that now we are living a new era, which he called it the age of Trump. Now, we shouldn't be surprised about the lack, that this person is not humble at all. But then we should ask, is he right? Are we living a new age of Trump in terms of, this is totally new. We never seen a leader go into war because he just wants it. A leader creating, a uniform Praetorian Guard running around a big continental country without identification and wearing masks and executing citizens. Is this new? And I am among those that think that this is not new at all. What is new is, one important thing that is new is that it happened before and we know it. We should have learned from the past. So this is good advertisement for my profession, historians, that we are still relevant, I think. But, what I have learned, like in my 30 years of research on the topic, is that it is important to understand our own context, and from understanding our own context, we also see the differences with the past, but also to pay attention to not only what are continuities with previous contexts, but rather also the issue of identification, that many of these leaders actually not only deny, the racist and, yes, fascist politics of the past, but also embrace them. That is to say, in our current political times, on a global scale, racism is not as toxic as it used to be. Homophobia is not as toxic as it used to be, and so on and so forth. So we are seeing a normalization, and maybe, this is the first answer or a mini answer to the question of what is new and what is not. I mean, what we are seeing is a normalization, and this is quite new, of fascist things from the past that for a big chunk of the 20th century, the chunk that, for example, I lived during the first decades of my life, were not okay. And now we see the return of that. That doesn't mean that fascism is returning, but at least we see that a kind of new appreciation of fascism and authoritarianism is being normalized, and that somehow, maybe laterally or maybe directly in many ways, provides, let's say, the possibilities for a return of fascism itself, or the fascists themselves. Now, one of the things that we shouldn't do, in my opinion, that these fields, of course, as I said before, they are being enlarged. I mean, now everybody is studying this. And we should not be gatekeeping in the sense of we people that have worked on this for a long time. We shouldn't say you cannot do this or we cannot do that. But I think, one of the things that I would like to say that people that are new to the field is that what they should do is something that often they don't do, which is what ourselves and our students do, which is read the bibliography. So if we read the bibliography, then we will answer in a way more complex way and a smarter way what is new and what is not. Because if you don't read anything, then you will study these things, and of course you will say, this is totally new, and I'm the first to see it. But it's not, the interesting thing about scholarship is that it humbles us down, all of us. A lot of people have said very smart things before us, and we are now contributing, hopefully, to that, to those many layers of knowledge. Now, why I became interested in these things, and maybe now, if you allow me, I will engage in a little bit of my own biography, is something that, as I said, because I live in dictatorship, I am from a country that suffered it and then created a democracy, and yet, dictators and people that supported them never left. And we struggle a lot as a country with that. At some point, in Argentina, there was the first Truth Commission. And the idea of the Truth Commission was not only to know the history of what happened, but rather also to provide documentation for the prosecution of those that that were perpetrators during the dictatorship. Then this idea was transformed, and I'm no one to judge, into Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where history was less attached to justice and more attached to, pacification without justice. Sorry to be that tough on other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. But we pay our big price for not wanting as a society and as a country to have a reconciliation. I mean, I still think that it was a good price to pay. That is to say that, as many human rights activists and scholars at the time said, I'm happy to talk with the perpetrators, but they are in prison and I go and visit them, rather than having this kind of, let's know what happened and let's reconcile. So yes, reconciliation, but after justice is served. I mean, these things, of course, I will return because, we saw a kind of big difference more recently between the US. I have been living in the US for 25 years. I'm a citizen of the US. And sadly, in the US, we didn't have this connection between history and justice. And the opposite happened in Brazil. In January 6th, Trump, as you know, when he lost an election, he attempted a coup d'etat. And it was okay for him, or okay enough, that he could be a candidate again. The opposite happened in Brazil. Jair Bolsonaro attempted a coup d'etat 1 year later after losing elections, and now he's in prison and he cannot be a candidate for president. So my point is this is another layer of my talk today, that we should think really globally without thinking that we cannot learn from the global south or something like that, because whatever the global south is, I think we have a lot to learn from what happened in Brazil or in countries like Argentina. Now, when I started being interested in these things, there was this, as I mentioned, this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The main perpetrators were put on trial, they were judged. If you, I don't know in Europe in which channel, but in the US it's Amazon Prime, there is this excellent movie, 1985, I don't know if you watch it, and it's about how difficult it was to put these people on trial, the perpetrators in Argentina. It's a beautiful, excellent movie. But soon after that, as I said, there were coup d'etats, and eventually the perpetrators were given an amnesty. And, this search for, connection between truth, history, and justice was lost. So that's one of the reasons people like me, and there were many of them, were interested in authoritarianism, fascism, and dictatorship. So we felt that this could return, we felt that there was no justice, and that didn't mean exactly, going and studying the dictatorship. Some people maybe studied medieval history, but they were interested in this kind of phenomena, hierarchies, authoritarianism, and violence, and so on. In my case, I entered the university knowing that I wanted to study the Argentine military dictatorship, but my advisors at the time said no. And in a way, I understand now why they said no. It was not a political kind of advice, but rather the issue that we are talking about, I guess, maybe in, 1995 or 6, and the dictatorship ended 1 decade before, like in 1983, and they thought that, there was not enough documentation, and also, wrongly, in my opinion, many historians at the time kind of thought that history should deal with the past that was somehow far away, that not having distance is a problem. I don't think we can afford this, especially in light of what's going on, and especially if you study authoritarianism or fascism, but at that point it was like the study of the dictatorship, we should leave that to political scientists, sociologists, they deal better with the present, we should keep, ourselves to the past. But because of that, I, for my, honor thesis, I proposed if I couldn't study the last dictatorship, I wanted to study the first. And that's how I began studying the fascists in the 1930s. So I started doing research on Argentina, when fascism happened. After finishing that research, I realize, and this is, something that led me to, other parts of research. And for the students here, it's also interesting to see that you never know how you end up writing or being interested in a project. The same for readers. Who knows? And it's nice to have that kind of freedom, which is, of course, led by curiosity. So, and in my case, I realized that I didn't know that my sources, the Argentine fascists, knew more about the European fascists than I knew. So I said, okay, my next project then it could be about European fascism. Something to do which is very hard if you are a student in Argentina. So I had this idea. I always admired the American Academy. I really liked many professors that were there. And I heard that maybe if I go to the US, they will give me a fellowship to study, and also they will give me money to travel to Europe, which is what happened. So I traveled to Italy and I started doing research on the Italian fascist archives and the connections with Latin America. Eventually, I didn't know it at the time. But, many times, maybe in another room, somebody shares our concerns and maybe is writing something about it. But at that time, I didn't know it, but my big concern with the historiography of fascism is that historians of fascism, big distinction here, by the way, it's not the same to be a fascist historian or an historian of fascism. I want to be an historian of fascism, never the other one. So other historians of fascism were working at the time without publishing that because they were starting new research on global connections among fascisms, what I was doing actually. I never talked with them, I met them later, but it's interesting, I guess in the context of that time we were all asking very similar questions. I guess, for career purposes, I was lucky enough that I finished the dissertation and I wrote a book on that. So my book was the first kind of monograph or book on transnational fascism. So and for the students here again, the normal move, I guess, academically speaking, in terms of career situations, would have been to remain in that field. Since I was a sort of pioneer in that field, it was becoming trendy and so on. But guess, after I was given promotion, I was tenured with that book, which supposedly gives you more peace and freedom to do whatever you want. But guess what I wanted to write? Any guess? So my next project, it was not on transnational fascism. I mean, sometimes they will invite me to this new conference and new fields, and I will just not go there. Because I said, no, I want to write a different thing. Not the best career move, I would say. Like, rather than riding the wave, I just went to another beach, and maybe I was sunbathing. I don't know. I don't know if the metaphor is okay. But any guess what I wanted to write about or research? No? Which one? No guess? No? Yes, dictatorship. So the book I couldn't write, and then I said, now I'm an associate professor, I'm tenured, I can do whatever I want. I will write I don't have advisors anymore, so it was going to be my first book without direction, which could be very problematic, and one misses the direction. It's great, it's an honor to have so many people that know a lot, to be really committed to reading your stuff. So it's great to have advisors when you're a student, but then I was alone. So, and then I decided to write this history, intellectual and I guess practical history of the Argentine dictatorship and how, starting in the 1920s, it led to fascism in the 1970s. And when I was writing that book and I was leaving my comfort zone, for a guy like me, my comfort zone, I guess, academic one, of course, is studying fascism in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. That's my comfort zone. That's my swimming style, if I was using a swimming. So, but then when I was approaching the 1960s and certainly the 1970s, when I was a young person in the period I was studying, I realized why my advisors were concerned. Because for an historian, I mean, it's, particularly for an historian, the way we are trained, it's very difficult to historicize your own times. And I kept wondering, when they are torturing this person, what I was doing in primary school, what I was thinking, and all these things, that it was a very hard book to write. And I always thought that my main hypothesis about Argentine fascism, which was that in contrast with some European cases, they were into a total kind of equation with the Catholic Church. So they wanted to be a kind of Christianized fascism, or as they call it, that's a quote, or like they will say that Jesus Christ was their leader, their duce, and so on. So they were pretty much into that appropriation of religion. And I thought, like I even mentioned an important priest at that time, the president of the Jesuits in Argentina at the time of the dictatorship. I mentioned this person for his, I guess, dubious or problematic role during that period. And I thought this is going to be the polemic part. At some point, that person became the Pope, the Argentine Pope. And, and I remember at the time, I received a call when he was selected as the Pope from the New York Times, in which they wanted me to talk about the Pope and the dirty war, which I did. But as other things, and that was in the front page, and I said, this is a way we historians can contribute to public dialogue. A few days after that, nobody talked about this to the present day. That was a gone issue. Nobody was interested, in talking about that, because the Pope had become very progressive, and, why talking about some things which were uncomfortable truth. So anyway, I thought that was going to be the polemic one. How much time I have? I just want to know, because I don't want to... 20 minutes. Oh, I have a lot of time. I'm rich in time. Okay. So at that time, I thought that was going to be the polemic part, but it was not. The polemic part led me to my new research, which is that when you study Argentine history, and I don't pretend or assume that you know Argentine history, but you may have heard about our dear leaders at the time, Juan Domingo Perón and Evita Perón. So, because it was a book that dealt with the entire history of Argentina in the 20th century, after the fascists of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, I thought I had to deal with Peronism. And that led me to open a new avenue of research on populism. So that was the most polemic chapter in the book, not the one about the dictatorship, to my surprise, not the one about the close links between the church, and the torture and the killings, but the one about Peronism. And what I said about Perón at the time was something that eventually I kind of came back in my following books, which is that Perón did the opposite of what the fascists did when they reached power. So, as you know, in the cases of Hitler and Mussolini, for example, they used democracy and democratic means to reach power and then destroy democracy from within. I mean, destroy democracy from the top and create a dictatorship. Now, the case with Peronism is a different period. I mean, in a way, so the starting point of another turning point. So we were talking about turning points and where Trumpism represents a turning point. I think it does. I don't know the end of the story. Hopefully it's a short, brief story, but it does represent a turning point vis-a-vis the precedent, the previous periods. And Peronism and other movements that happened at the time represented a new turning point. 1945 at large represented a turning point. Think about the history of your country. I mean, and how, at one point, especially after 1945 and the end of the war, it became a very different country to what it had been in the previous years. In other words, democracy, which is a big issue for many of us, returned. Now, in Argentina, it was different, and Perón did a different thing, which is that he was the strong man in a dictatorship. He participated of the coup d'etat that happened in 1943, and he was a very much, I would say, fascist or proto-fascist or quite fascist dictatorship, I would say, or quite close to fascism. And he did the opposite of what Hitler and Mussolini did. So he basically destroyed dictatorship from within, called for elections, and created a democracy from the top. So he was elected. In fact, he was elected as the candidate of the dictatorship, and he defeated what was a popular union, an anti-fascist union, of all the spectrum of parties that existed before the coup d'etat that he had promoted. So he was against the Communist Party, the Radical Party, the Center-Right Party, the Socialist Party. All parties were together against Perón. He won. The result of that is a kind of what I call in my following book, which is, and I remember my wife, she asked me, okay, what are you going to do after your Dirty War dictatorship book? Because it's true that book was, it was like, as I guess Darth Vader would say, the circle was complete. So I pointed, I started because of this, now I wrote the book, what do I do now? And I always have questions like you, and I follow up those questions by writing books. So I said, I want to study more of this populism, and I want to study what happened with Perón on a global scale. So that was then my next book, From Fascism to Populism in History, in which my argument was that first in Argentina and later in Brazil, Bolivia, and other Latin American countries, and eventually the whole world, Eastern Europe first, and then, the whole world, basically an understanding of democracy that started after 1945 in Latin America became widespread. And this understanding of democracy meant a kind of reformulation of fascism and authoritarian trends in a democratic key. I just explained why Perón did the opposite of Mussolini and Hitler did. A fascist will never destroy dictatorship to be elected. There is no point in that. So basically, when populism emerged as a regime form, for the first time in history, this happened in Latin America. In the Q&A, if you want, we can talk about why Latin America, why not Europe first or Africa first, or the US. But basically, the fact that people that had been dictators and fascists were able to turn to, somehow refashion themselves as democratic implied that, a new form of democracy also happened. Because this was not liberal democracy, this was not constitutional democracy, but it was a democracy which had fascism behind. It was not fascist, but it was authoritarian. It was against check and balances. It was against the independence of the judiciary. It was against the existence of a free press, and yet it provided, for free elections. So Perón will say, so for example, like, let's say you have let's imagine, anyway, let's do a fantasy exercise here. So you have a populist government in the Peronist way in the Netherlands or in the Trumpist way. He does the same. This is typical of the politics of naming that this kind of politics presents. And Utrecht becomes, Perón City. And that is what Perón did with 2 provinces in Argentina. One province was named Provincia or Province Juan Perón. The other one was named Provincia Eva Perón. Now, these 2 people were alive at the time. And when they were criticized, Perón said, you don't like it, vote me out. But they were winning elections. So this is not fascism, because fascism doesn't care about elections, and the legitimacy of a fascist leader is not rooted in electoral legitimacy. So in a way, Perón complained. He said, they call me a fascist, and I'm not a fascist. In private, then he would write about fascism, and he said, I admired Mussolini so much, I admired Hitler so much, but this is not the time, he said, of National Socialism. The world has changed. And now is the time of social nationalism. What he meant by that is populism. So populism is many things. It's a very complex issue, many great books, written about it. But I would like just to stick with that element, that populism, as authoritarian as it is, participates of the electoral game and respects, at least formally, many rules of democracy. They never go full frontal, or they never go the fascist way. So when I finished that book, it was 2016. There was a presidential campaign in the United States, and maybe because I live in New York City, maybe because historians, we are not great in predicting the future, I have to recognize I am among those that thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win. So, and I thought that Trump was an example of an extreme form of populism, one that was closer to fascism, but I thought that it was not going to reach power. Then I have to say this because I don't know if it happens to you, but after that day when Trump won the election, a couple of things happened. A lot of people told me, or I heard them saying, I said he was going to win. Well, I never heard you say that. I thought, I'm very polite, so I didn't say anything. But apparently, many people thought something that went, I guess, silent, and they kept to their heads. So, especially if you live in the big cities at the time. So I remember, I traveled, I went to a presentation in Chicago, and in Northwestern, close to Chicago, and already in LaGuardia Airport, I saw a lot of Trump kind of signals and signs that you will not see in New York City. And I was wondering, maybe this is something that people like me are not seeing. And then I said, no, I'm not seeing this. I don't want to see it. Now, because of that, in my manuscript, I said, I wrote, in his failed campaign to the presidency, Donald Trump said this, and that, quite fascist, quite connected to fascism, and so on. My editor at UC Press, Kate Marshall, said, Federico, I also don't think he's going to win, but let's stay with the book a little bit more. Let's wait. Let's not send it for publication. And of course, after the election, I wasn't thinking about rewriting my book, but I was very sad and depressed. 2 days later, I realized I had to rewrite the book, and especially replace those sections where I said, in his failed campaign, in his failed bid to the presidency. The point is that, sadly, I say this as a citizen, the main point of the book did not change. I wonder whether the this political style that I was representing, I wonder it aloud. I had a section, even in that manuscript, which is fascism returning, I ask. This is 2016. And then, it was about, sadly, and this happened with my last books, sadly, as a citizen, is that the books were sort of more right than I thought they would be, and actually I'm very sad about it. I'm not happy. Who wants to live in a militarized society where citizens are executed? And yet that was a section, I have to say, of chapter number 1 of my current book. So I will get to that in a second. So now I guess I have 10 minutes, more or less? Yes. Okay. So that is, so I wrote that book. I actualized it. It was published when Trump started his first presidency. Then COVID happened. I was in New York. I was shocked by the amount of lies and propaganda that people like Trump or Bolsonaro were spreading, how they oppose science, and basically how they were duping the population, and the outcome of that was death. And for a guy that studies fascism such as myself, that's the question I was asking. So I wrote a book which is called A Brief History of Fascist Lies. So I wanted to see why fascists lie in such a way that not only they believe their lies, but they want the world to be like their lies. So they transform reality. I will return to this in 3 minutes, because that's one of the chapters and the elements that I will be finishing my talk with. So I will return to this. So hang on the lies issue. Now, then January 6th happened, and I thought the Fascist Lies book was my last book on this issue. As I said, I was going to return to my 1930s and write about that. And then January 6th happened, and I thought, this is the last remnant of the old populism, because populism can be very authoritarian, anti-democratic even, but they always root their legitimacy in free elections. And in January 6th, I don't know, I think it's a technical discussion at this point, not political, that if you lose an election and you attempt to remain in power by violent means, the outcome is that you are a dictator. You cannot be a democratically elected leader, meaning a democratic leader. So I was kind of asked at that time, and this is an important, moment for me in all my years of as a researcher and public intellectual, that I was asked by the Research Commission of the American Congress, the Congressional Commission, I was first interviewed by them, and then I was asked to write a report on what happened in January 6th. And I wrote this report with a colleague of mine, Jason Stanley, who wrote his own books on fascism as well, great books, and very important books. And then we wrote the report, and I said, okay, this report, like at least my part, certainly my part, is the script of my new book, because I think there is this is radicalizing in ways that I guess, let's say this, the hypothesis was confirmed in a way that me, the person, not the author, didn't want to see. I was there. And so basically I wrote about this, and I wrote this book, which is my last book, book number 8, which is the Wannabe Fascist, Guide to Understanding the Greatest Threat to Democracy, which is the second edition is going to be published in English in a few months. Second edition because I wrote this before the election, and now we have lived part of the Trump regime in which the main hypotheses have radicalized in ways that, again, that are very worrying. So now let me finish with the following question and answer. I will ask the question, I will refine the question of what is new, because when people ask the question of what is new, what they often mean is Trump a fascist? Are people like Trump fascists? Do they want fascism to finally return? Do they want to destroy democracy? How much violence they can spread? They want to spread violence, and so on and so forth. So basically, my usual answer to this question would have been, let's say, when I started working on this, on fascism, would be if somebody asked me this question, especially outside the academy. And again, like as a scholar, I don't live in the academy, I live in my house, and the academy is only a small part of my life. Like I don't want to be part of that ivory tower. I write mostly in my home or in cafes, and again, like people ask me a lot this question. Oh, you work on fascism? Tell me. Is Trump a fascist? And I would have said in the past, a younger version of me would have said, do you have an hour? Because this is a very complex issue. Even more, can you register in my seminar on fascism and then we discuss this for a semester? Can I give you a free copy of my book and then we talk about it? And so on. But then it is the case that people asking this question, they represent a genuine concern and they don't have time for my ivory tower answer, like you have an hour. Who has an hour? We have an hour. They don't. They have to go on with their lives. And I am really appreciative of the fact that they are concerned and they want to know about history. So our job as historians, I think, is not to engage in that typical academic answer, but rather to try to answer the question as succinctly as we can. Now, to your disappointment, I would say that I wrote a book to give like a short answer that I can give you in 1 minute. But I wrote a book about this because it has different histories and examples and narratives. But then my answer disappoints many people. And I use an expression that we use in Spanish, because I'm asked, is Trump a fascist? Ni. Yes and no. So that's why I chose this title of wannabe fascist, because this is not normal populism as we knew it, and yet, so this is within the fascist spectrum. This is quite fascist and not yet complete fascism. Now, my short answer is this: like fascism can be defined in many ways. As I said, it's very complex, and we can give like a list of 50 features, even more, maybe 100 features. But the point is that, again, we don't have time. I mean, it's a question of time. And the book at the end of the day, and my work, my recent work and my talk today even, represents a warning. I want it to represent a warning about the times we are living and how dangerous they are. So my answer was, I will focus on 4 pillars of fascism. I will have 1 chapter on each. And these pillars of fascism, central to fascism, not central at all in populism. And we see in the new wannabe fascists, which are extreme populists of the right, we see a return to these pillars. So pillar number 1 is violence and the militarization of politics. Something that is, the idea that politics represents a war and that people dress as pseudo-soldiers to fight that war against people that don't think like them, and violence as a means of replacing, open discussion. And even more so, violence as a kind of source of power. And here fascism is distinguishes itself not in a good way. It represented a stark difference between itself and other isms. Because of course all isms, liberalism, communism, socialism, conservatism, historically the instances of violence were, horrible and spread among all these, ideologies. But in all these children of the Enlightenment, the idea is that, at least in theory, is that violence is a means to a peaceful end. Maybe they are hypocritical about it, or maybe that's not true in practice. It doesn't disqualify the fact that this is the ideology. So Lenin, for example, like taking this very obscure category from Marx, barely used by Marx, of the dictatorship of the proletariat, created an idea of a transitional form of authoritarian government. But supposedly at the end of it, there was no more dictatorship. Something which goes against the fascist understanding of violence and of dictatorship, in the sense that violence is the source of power, not only because it can, I guess in the sense of Max Weber, the German thinker, a state is powerful because of its ability to monopolize violence, the monopoly of violence, but the power resides in the fact that violence is not unleashed. So that is a powerful movement and a powerful state. Fascists, basically communist, socialists, liberals and so on, they agree with that notion. Whereas fascists actually believe, they agree with the idea that violence is a source of power, but they believe the more violent you are, the more powerful you are. It's about unleashing violence. And they regard people that do not engage in violence as weak or even degenerate. So that's element number one, the idea that violence is a good thing, the idea, the glorification of that violence, and the creation of people that are not real soldiers, that are not fighting wars, but they are fighting a war against those that disagree with them. So when it happens in the opposition, they create these paramilitary formations. When they became the government, these paramilitary formations were integrated into the government, such as, the SA, for example, or the SS. They were not part of the government, they became part of the state. So now I'm running out of time for sure. I ran out of time, or I have a few minutes? How? 1 minute. Let's say 1 minute, okay. So in that sense, that is pillar number one. Pillar number two, I already talked about lies and propaganda. I will give you, well, maybe later I give you an example about that, but the idea is transforming reality in order for reality to be like the lies. Replacing not only the perception of reality with lies, but transforming reality in order for reality to be like the lies they lie about. Number three is what I call the politics of xenophobia, racism, and extreme demonization as a key way of doing politics. It's not that populists did not engage in demonization, but they thought that extreme demonization, which eventually ends in deportation, concentration, or even in some cases, extermination, was not politically productive. Someone like Perón will say, they will not vote me if I do this. And finally, dictatorship, which I talked about before. I will end with that. Fascists believe in an idea of permanent dictatorship, not dictatorship as a means or a transition to a better world, but dictatorship as the best of worlds. And again, this was a big no for populists in the 20th century, much less so for certain wannabe fascists now. So I will finish with that. Thank you.
Federico,
I sit now?
thank you. Yeah, okay. You can sit up there. Later I will summon you back on the stage. But first we'll continue with our next speaker. She's a postdoctoral researcher here at Utrecht University. And she works also for the Visions of the Future project, which investigates and compares alternatives to neoliberal capitalism. And they research a lot of these alternatives for the future, such as degrowth and post-growth, the care economy, property democracy, and authoritarian populism, and even more. So we invited her to reflect on Mr. Finchelstein's story and also maybe add some to it. So please, a very warm applause for Hannah McHugh.
Hello. Okay, so I'll try and pick up exactly where Professor Finchelstein left off. Tonight, we were advertised our populists turning into fascists, and so I can imagine all of you are concerned to understand how we interpret increasingly far-right recent movements. And to that end, here I have some pictures of three very different leaders, but perhaps, like me, you share this intuition that there's something that just looks and feels similar about these kinds of politics. So Professor Finchelstein has really eloquently set out his view that these leaders perhaps could be described as wannabe fascists, if not fascists. But he's done that by arguing they operate inside democratic systems while drawing on fascist traditions. In particular, he summarized their violence, lies and propaganda, dictatorship, and xenophobia as crucial features of fascism. In this talk and reflection, I would like to focus on these fascist traditions as cultural movements and therefore emphasize some other aspects that we see in fascism. Professor Finchelstein's very stark warning to us is that democracy can erode from within, And I'm going to consider how in this talk that involves not just the decay of institutions and laws and rights, but how cultural narratives and symbols and imagery can reorient our society. And I'll finish by emphasizing that to resist fascism, we can't just protect our democratic institutions, but more we need to reinvigorate our democratic culture. So fascist stories, and cultural stories in particular, center on very predictable elements. There's this famous hat you can see here, which says, "Make America Great Again." That draws on a long-held fascist preoccupation with a sense of national rebirth for a humiliated or declining nation. Here you can see Narendra Modi, who is using similar rhetoric. India is now striving to regain its lost strength. Fascists lean on this idea of the strong leader, and at the same time, they're dissolving the distinction between the leader and the state and political morality. So Trump's quote here, "I am your justice," I think captures that very well. And we can see, Bolsonaro's ultra-nationalist claim, "Brazil above everything, God above everyone." So I'm going to try and explain some of the cultural power or the nature of these narratives. But to do so, I think first we need to ask the question, in what conditions can these fascist cultural stories thrive? Or perhaps another way to put that is, why are we seeing this now? Fascism first arose in the early 20th century in conditions of very profound structural crisis. So after the First World War, it's quite evident that political orders were absolutely shattered. Systems of empire were beginning to collapse, and we were seeing the shifting of the global hegemon towards the United States. Meanwhile, industrialization was heralding in mass change. So there was a pull of workers from regions to cities, leaving behind collapsing and shrinking communities, and a new mass media was rapidly changing social life. With that mass media and the rise of mass society, there was a financial crisis which totally undermined that mass society's faith in existing political orders. So I've characterized here on the slides the crisis in global economic, work, and its social dimensions. And taken together, I think that I could suggest that this led to what we might describe as a crisis of profound political disorientation. So in times of political disorientation, clearly what follows is that people want orientation. There is a need for political orientation. And indeed, a century ago, 3 political movements rose trying to offer direction in all of this uncertainty, and we saw the battle between communism, liberal democracy, and fascism. It's a room full of smart people, so I'm sure you'll already be drawing comparisons with the 21st century. And today, we face not new, but also not unsimilar challenges and changes. So the global order that was agreed upon after World War II, which centered on American economic and political leadership, is now strained. The 2008 financial crisis undermined faith in the political order and heralded in periods of significant austerity and preceded an unprecedented rise in global inequality. Globalization, financialization, and digitalization have significantly reshaped not only our working lives by rendering employment increasingly precarious and remote, but they've also reshaped our mass communications. Much of our lives now unfold online. As many of the decisions that shape our lives seem to move further out of our reach, it's harder and harder to see who or what is responsible. We might not actually know if there are real people behind the algorithms that determine our social feeds, or which jobs were offered, or make bureaucratic decisions on our behalf. And likewise, it might be difficult to recognize whether the market we are subject to really reflects human choices or is some kind of natural force beyond anyone's control. And at the same time, modern mass media makes it harder for us to access reliable information, and with that, our shared sense of truth is increasingly unstable. So we too live in times of profound political disorientation. So what is political disorientation? Even the slides pronounced it wrong with an N on the bottom there. I would suggest that disorientation can be readily understood with 3, perhaps seemingly simple, but I suggest hard to answer questions. What is lost when we are disoriented is a ready sense of Who is in control of the power I'm subject to? How can I understand and contest the injustice that I feel? And how can I understand myself and my place in society? Fascist narratives hold very ready answers to these complex questions. And I'm going to talk through them, and I'll talk through them in their cultural, moral, and aesthetic terms. So, first, fascist stories. The fascist imaginary begins by constructing histories of national greatness. So for Mussolini, this was the Roman Empire. For Hitler's Germany, this was the mythological Aryan civilization. And these historically great nations, we are told, have been humiliated and weakened and corrupted by enemies, whether that's Jews, communists, or otherwise. And if only we could rid these nations from the corrupting influence, then they could be reborn. Now, fascist movements don't just promise reform, they promise something more, which is regeneration. So on these stories, violence and exclusion are not seen as acts of cruelty, but rather they're necessary acts of renewal. And what is it that they promise? They promise a glorious future. So early fascist movements came along with artistic movements such as futurism. I've pulled an example here. So the industrial age was being glorified in a way that politics and culture and art was merging together into one consistent story. A renewed civilization was going to be driven forward by strength and motion and technological domination. Now, interestingly, I think elements of these stories recur today. A mythical greatness of the past, but perhaps now sat along something like a techno-futurist narrative. Last week, Quinn Slobodian was here in Utrecht, and he spoke about Elon Musk's pushes to colonize Mars, his interest in breaking down the boundaries between humans and AI technology, and how these aims are justified with reference to the need for civilizational survival. So today, too, we are seeing a pairing of social conservatism and futurist elements. But how, though, can we justify, or are these stories being justified? So quite understandably, you might be uncomfortable seeing the title Fascist Morality. Maybe you think that's abhorrent. Maybe you think it's oxymoronic. I am making no claim that I think fascism is a moral form of politics, but I do want to clarify that it starts from a very fundamentally different moral premise than liberalism. So I think clarifying this is important because it helps us understand the internal justification of these orders. So for liberals, broadly conceived, when I say liberals, I mean those who adhere to liberalism. You could be a Green, you could be a centre-right, traditional centre-right. The first premise of politics for you will be a commitment to the equal moral worth of individuals. So the first unit of political value is the person. And then the task of a political order is to mediate the normal disagreements of political life while respecting the equal moral worth of all the members of its society. So this tends towards a commitment to pluralism, to mutually supporting political freedom, and toleration as we coexist together. Liberal political institutions exist not to enforce a single unified will, but to allow people with different beliefs and identities and toleration to coexist together. Conversely, for fascists, the first premise of politics is not the individual, it is in fact the collective. The fascist politics begins from the idea that society should be imagined like a living body. And then if something is wrong with one individual within that living body, like a disease, they can be excluded and they can be eradicated. It is a brutal logic, but it's internally coherent. If the body is going to survive, then parts of it might be expended. And on this premise, the people or the nation is understood not as a collection of individuals, but as one collective entity with a shared destiny. And the health of the collective body becomes the highest political value. So baked into this idea of the collective lies a very deeply hierarchical view of human beings. Stories that emphasize purity and strength, often, as I say, paired with this idealized vision of a glorious past, connect the true people, the nation, to a specific land. And together, these stories and these narratives can reinforce the belief that some people are inherently superior to others. Okay, so having shown then the moral premise of fascism and how this links to strong cultural narratives, one very important further aspect remains to be attended to as we respond to how fascism produces or responds to political disorientation. So fascism does not work through abstract ideas or arguments about institutions or policies. It doesn't just turn up and offer a political program. More than that, fascism offers a way of living. Fascism offers a political experience. It is a visible and it is an embodied form of politics. So one thing that I think is very well understood by the far right is that often politics is downstream from culture. So we can consider how fascism uses symbols and imagery and identity to attract and coordinate its followers. And often these cultural and aesthetic clues can elicit an emotional experience in us. So to make a general example of what I mean by this kind of aesthetic clue, which is non-specific to fascism, it's possible to be moved by the waving of a flag, by the pull of a march, by the singing of a national anthem, without having a full personal account of your own relation to those things. As a British woman, I enjoy singing God Save the King, whatever my views of the British monarchy happen to be. We can be moved aesthetically by these performances. Now, fascism goes further than just the waving of a flag. Fascism goes further than merely displaying some sort of nationalist aesthetic. Fascism is itself an aestheticized form of politics. And it's extraordinarily effective at this level. It's extraordinarily effective at offering a lived and felt vision of meaning and belonging in times of disorientation. The philosopher Walter Benjamin captured something very essential, I think, about this dynamic. Benjamin argued that fascism responds to mass discontent not by transforming the underlying economic structures of society, but by aestheticizing politics. And by this, he is saying that instead of giving people real political agency over the forces that shape their lives, fascist movements instead give them dramatic forms of expression. So fascism offers everyday citizens a way of being in the place of political power and in the place of undermining the structural kinds of domination that disoriented them in the first place. So by operating through mass rallies or synchronized crowds or military spectacles or monumental architecture, people are invited to feel powerful as part of some collective drama. Fascists are creating a visual impression of a perfectly ordered and powerful society using this metaphor of the powerful body. And I think importantly and interestingly, this way of being can also operate very much at the level of individuals. So at the individual level, the level of each of us, it can offer direction. Strength, power, and purity can be physically embodied. So individual bodies can be displayed as symbols of collective vitality. As Susan Sontag observed, strength and discipline can become both personal and political virtues, and idealized gender roles are therefore celebrated within fascist traditions. So to try and make this clearer, I've selected some images. In the center here, you can see the front page of Action, the newspaper of Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists in 1936, highlighting this aestheticized ideal of masculinity. And next to this, I have shown an image from, I don't know if anyone's seen the new Louis Theroux on Netflix, Inside the Manosphere. But the manosphere is a term which describes online media influencers associated with the far right, who deliver highly aestheticized content displaying hypermasculinity together with strongly misogynist tones. And then similarly, you can see a propagandistic painting by Adolf Wissel from 1939 in Germany, which depicts a traditional role of motherhood. And I've paired this with a headline which refers to recent trends of tradwives. Tradwives are women who are supposedly bucking the trends of female emancipation through work and seeking to adopt more traditional and submissive gender roles. So I think taken together, we now have a way of revisiting the challenge of disorientation. So the first question was, who is in control of the power I'm subjected to? What the fascists answer? The once strong nation is corrupted by elites and betrayers or external contaminants. How can I understand and contest the injustice that I feel? A strong man leader must lead the nation and the true people to a glorious rebirth. And how can I understand myself and my place in society? Well, as part of the collective, I must strive to uphold myself as a pure, strong, and disciplined member of the nation's traditional society. I must participate and advance towards a glorious future in the process of national rebirth. And so, it seems, fascism is especially effective in times of disorientation and is offering a cultural story to those who suffer under that disorientation. However, at this point, you might reasonably be thinking, wait a minute, The leaders and the vanguards of these movements often are very wealthy, are privileged, are full of hypocrisies, and they don't actually suffer under this disorientation, or perhaps even believe in some of the fascist answers that are proposed. Well, I would say you were correct. Fascism has always involved this very important alliance between the elites of the movement and the masses. And actually, and importantly, their incentives could diverge significantly. So to explain this, I've already said that I think fascism involves a very hierarchical view of society. On such a view, the special treatment of those at the top of the hierarchy is absolutely plausible for these movements. So the tech billionaires, representative of a glorious future and most hailed among men, they are all men, for their perceived meritocratic success, are easily afforded extra rights and public and political valorization. Similarly, corruption and hypocrisy among leaders of these movements is not seen as contravention of the premise of liberal equality. Rather, they are courageous expressions of a movement. The leader is the nation embodied, acting for the collective, and is valued as such. So this is why corruption and unconstitutional behavior undermines the left and center, but actually rarely touches the support held for the far right. However, arguably and more fundamentally, this divergence between the elites and the masses relates to a crucial final feature of fascism that I'll emphasize. It's a non-exhaustive list of features. They're just pulling out some alternatives to what we've heard already. But something that I think must be discussed and can't be ignored is fascism's relation to capitalism. Fascism does not seek to dismantle capitalism or to rectify inequalities. So today I've set out that, or I've hinted that many are disoriented by the effects of neoliberal markets, financial systems, global supply chains, and technological infrastructures that are shaping our lives in profound ways while appearing impersonal. These interacting elements appear alongside vastly widening inequalities and increasingly pressing risks of climate catastrophe. Yet fascist regimes do not seek to undermine these logics, even if they lead to these outcomes, and they preserve the features of fascism, of capitalism, that have made them possible. For instance, they preserve private property, they preserve profit incentives. Historically, fascist movements have relied heavily on industry elites and suppressed labor movements. They've mobilized industry and capital only in the service of their national power. So in other words, capitalism remained largely intact, but it was embedded within a strongly authoritarian political order. So today, talks of deregulation, moves to uphold tech elites and the wealth of billionaires, denial of welfare to those who are not considered part of the hierarchical in-group, actually follow a consistent political logic. Libertarian economic rhetoric can combine with an authoritarian political leadership to reinforce the existing structures of power. The elites are offering the masses an expressive politics while hoarding and justifying their own wealth and power. So in this sense, as I say, fascist politics does not challenge the structures that produce disorientation. The fascist vision of the future cements and reifies capitalist inequality. So here on the slides, I've pulled an excellent collection of primary sources that identifies Mussolini's style of crony capitalism, but I've also put a picture here from Trump's inauguration, where I think it's interesting that tech billionaires were chosen to sit at the front, hailed as some kind of national pride for their financial and technological so-called success as an example of this reification. So tentatively at this point, we can summarize some features of what a fascist vision for the future may look like. Reified capitalist and social inequality within a hierarchical and exclusionary society justified by a collective and organic moral worldview. Quite grim, quite scary, but I don't want to end there. Having just painted this scary picture of how democracies can erode from within, including with culture, I'd actually like to end by making a few observations as to what democratic resistance against wannabe fascists might be. So the challenge, I think, that is raised by these arguments is, what is the culture of democracy? What does a liberal democracy look and feel like? So if fascism is offering a world that feels clear and morally ordered at the collective level, yet still livable by individuals, in conditions of disorientation, it's not going to be enough for us to appeal to abstract feelings, to institutions, to procedures, or to rights. At the personal level, this won't offer a way of living or a way of being that resonates. Technical solutions and fixes will represent a decaying order and actually risk increasing the perceived gap between people and their democratic governments. Courts can slow fascism, and for now, elections could challenge it, but we need to operate at a much deeper level. To truly protect these institutions, we need to argue for and show what a democratic culture can really offer. We need to make a democratic movement capable of actually moving people. So the democratic vision for the future, I'll sketch some ideas here. I'd love to hear more what others in the room think, because it truly is our challenge. But I would suggest it should draw on the already strong assets that we have within democratic culture. The emphasis of solidarity, mutual care, respect, diversity, difference, all of these need to be celebrated. We should paint a vision for the future that undermines the structures that disempower agents politically. There should be material change, and we need to build a cultural movement that supports this political project. We need a reinvigorated and lived culture of democracy. So to finally respond to the question, are populists turning into fascists? Well, we may not be there yet, but certainly elements of fascist politics has re-emerged, and we need to be, as Professor Finchelstein said, very vigilant to stop wannabe fascists from dismantling our democratic culture. And I hope this talk has equipped you with some tools to recognize how that happens and how we might resist. Thank you.
Hannah, thank you so much for your talk. I would like to use the remainder of the time for you, for the audience, to ask questions to both of our speakers. So I would like to invite Professor Federico Finchelstein over here and Dr. Hannah McHugh over here. And then I will give you some space to ask questions. I need to make one small confession. I made a mistake in my PowerPoint, so I'm going to very... on the background, you will all see me doing it, but I'm going to change the slide. Fortunately, I have a colleague up here, Nora. Could you come over here, please? And she will hold the microphone for a part of the Q&A. So you can ask questions. Who has a question for one of our speakers? Up here, I see someone. Yeah, could you take it over, then I will come back to you in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, thanks. First I want to thank you for emphasizing especially the psychological part of the human being on this story, because I think we can talk about individuals, about how they got the power, etc. But if the society is not supporting them or staying silent, then this won't be happening. So it's important to take the human into consideration. Following it, I will make two statements and ask a question following up. First statement is, I observe in the recent society that there is an us versus them syndrome is increasing, not only with the right wing, but I also see as a society that is happening. Not necessarily Western society, but Eastern society is also doing it. Not only right wing, as I stated, left wing is also doing it. Every individual started doing this one more and more. So which, in other words, the tolerance towards the other side started decreasing. The statement two that I'm going to make is, I observe also an increase in the stakes. It's not anymore a democratic difference, but those democratic differences lead to a greater stake. It's not that we are choosing a coffee or tea, but we are choosing between climate change versus are we going to die within 20 years. And that's a bigger stake than choosing a coffee and tea. My question to you is, how can we at the moment as human species can kind of address this increasing intolerance towards the other side to solve this us versus them problem? Thanks.
Okay, yeah, thank you for your question. I think, yeah, you're reflecting something very important about the times that we live in, which is polarized times. You can talk about us versus them. We can also talk about the very different sources of information that we receive through our media channels. And something which I think is important to emphasize about a democracy which functions well is it's built on tolerance and diversity and negotiation between views. So it's clearly a very destructive feature. one thing that I've emphasized in my talk is how fascist narratives and fascist answers are very simple answers to what are actually complex problems. Like you say, coffee or tea is a simple problem, but how to solve climate change is something very, very complex. Now, at the same time, as acknowledging that a good democracy functions with these kinds of negotiations and these recognitions of difference, I think a very healthy challenge that is put to us, there's a conservative poet, Robert Frost, who made the comment, the problem with you liberals is you can't argue for what you believe in. So there's something about, it's not really a winner online and in this kind of media age to actually talk to complexity and to that kind of deference, but it's surely something we have to find more toleration for, and it's surely something we have to find a way of presenting as a lived political project.
It was also for me, or okay? Yeah, I mean, this is it's a challenge, and you know, with Hannah today, we have been talking about this many times, no, in many conversations today. That, you know, in an academic way, I mean, and we scholars, we don't have to, you know, we don't do policy, and that is to say that I have, in a way, I can afford to have a more kind of unflexible position. I mean, in the following sense. So let's say on one side there are people that are against racism, and on the other side, I mean, as sort of your coffee or tea, you have people that are quite racist, they support racism, or they are okay with racism. So for me, as an historian of racism, I mean, there are no two positions vis-a-vis democracy. Democracy stands against racism and all those things that support racism or fascism or totalitarianism or whatever you want to put into the question. Those things are against democracy. Now, when, again, I don't do policy, but when you enter the realm of politics, the question becomes way more difficult to address, in the sense that if you ask me as a scholar, who are people voting for example, this racist candidate? I would say, if you go back, let's say, to the history of Nazism, there were the Nazis who were really anti-Semitic and racist, and there were those that supported the Nazis, although they saw themselves as not being that anti-Semitic and racist. Now, as an historian, I will say, well, all those supporters of Nazism, we need to distinguish among them. On the one side, they are the ultra-racist, and on the other side, the moderate racist, but they were all racist. I mean, if it would be difficult for somebody, like at least conceptually, to say, you know, I take a middle stand. I am neither with the racist nor with the anti-racist. Well, that is a very racist thing to say, or at least a kind of enabling of racism thing to say. Let's think about the same question vis-a-vis fascism. Somebody says, I'm not a fascist, I'm not with fascism, but also I'm not against fascism. Or let's say Nazism, I'm not, I mean, and these kind of arguments on a kind of conceptual level, they are very easy to distinguish. Now, in politics, maybe these people that are moderates and even don't see themselves as being part of a very problematic anti-democratic, you know, formation or coalition or form of politics, then maybe on a policy level, you know, and I think here history and hopefully information helps, can be peeled off from this kind of authoritarian trend. The hardcore racists or fascists, I don't think those, you know, they will be way easier to convince that this is bad for society. And what I mean by bad for society is, you know, not only me or my group, but all our society. And so, I mean, these are the things that is important, I think, also for scholars to think about. Although, if you push me on the scholarly side, I would say, well, if you have an actor, I'm studying this in history in the past, and you have someone that says, I have nothing, you know, I'm not for the persecution of the Jews, but also I'm not against it, well, that's quite a fascist or Nazi stance, a moderate one.
I'll come back to this corner later, maybe, if I have time, but there's a lot of people with questions. I'll go a bit to the back. Someone here with a question? Yes?
Hi, Professor Finchelstein, at the beginning of your talk, you asked yourself the question, you talked about how people of the 1950s asked yourself this question, how could we have prevented the rise of fascism? Dr. McHugh, at the end of your talk, you gave a solution. We have to, I'm paraphrasing, but strengthen our democratic institutions. My question is that enough when a lot of the followers of these proto-fascist politicians are actively rejecting the democratic institutions and basically calling people who try to strengthen these institutions like pedosexuals, dumb leftists, or even like engage in conspiracy theories? Like, is it enough at this point?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. It is a big challenge and a big fight to protect democratic institutions and democratic way of life in these conditions. I emphasize, as you rightly pulled out, the need for us to have a cultural movement, but it's also true that we need to address the material conditions that produce the kind of disorientation that made fascism or makes fascism an attractive solution. So I mentioned in my talk that fascism has a relationship with inequality, it has a relationship with capitalism, it has a relationship with the existing injustices that we live with today. So democracies don't just need to thrive as democratic institutions for their own sake, they also need to address these material problems and these causes of dislocation. So strong hierarchies, strong senses of inequality, alliance between business elites and these leaders are only made possible because we live in a hugely hierarchical capitalist system. So there needs to be an addressing of the material and social welfare that will allow for a renewed kind of politics and faith in democratic institutions. What I think is very dangerous is when democratic parties and movements try to dig in to defend themselves against these attacks from the far right just by somewhat accepting that or pretending that these institutions are perfect as they are and they're delivering as they should. That won't be effective. There has to be a political vision, a political project that these democratic institutions are moving towards, which address, as I say, the problems that make fascism attractive. But I also think such a project can't get off the ground unless we have a social and cultural movement that supports its ability to do so.
Oh, I agree. One of the issues that, of course, I agree with Hannah that are central here is that this doesn't appear out of, nothing. There were a lot of, the best we have is our democracies, but of course there were a lot of problems, and there are a lot of problems that explain why these kind of magical solutions are presented. Mythical solutions not based on real explanations, but rather based on, fake data and propaganda. Now, the question is, there are a couple of dimensions here. One is that, like if you think, for example, of the U.S. Congress, the Chamber of Representatives, but also even more the Senate. The amount of money, if you distribute, it doesn't matter the party, they are all millionaires there. And the point is it's normal that people will ask themselves, why are these people representing us? They don't take the subway as I do, they don't even pay taxes maybe as I do, and so on and so forth. To use an academic term, there is a clear problem of political representation in the sense that many people do not feel, themselves to be represented by their representatives. That is the context in which suddenly somebody like Trump appears saying, these people, this indirect form of democracy is not real, and what you need is a direct form of democracy, because if you vote for me, you will be there at the White House, for example, because I represent you, I am one of you, and if you vote me, I will go to the White House, you will be there. In reality, the leader in the case of Trump, he's a billionaire who doesn't live, even who lives a life which is even more removed from the people, the majority of the people, than that of the millionaire representatives or senators. And in fact, he's at the White House. It's not that the people are at the White House. So that is based on a lie. Now, the question is, what do we understand as democracy? Because democracy is not only political rights, but it's also about social and economic rights. A democracy without, equality doesn't work that much, and is prone to be attacked, corrupted, or even destroyed by people like, these wannabe fascists or other forms of extremism. So my point is, I don't think even if we have the chance to go back, and I hope we do in different cases, in the case of the US, to a form of politics that is more, dialogic, that is more into the deliberation and procedures, we should also remember, I think, that what was before wasn't enough. That's why this is happening. It's not that, America needs to be, was great before Trump. So that is not the point. He will say, make America great again, but of course he relies on the fact that there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the economic situation. Now, his response, his magical solution is demonization. And this is not new. German social democrats will call these ideas the socialism of the imbeciles, because in fact they are not selling any sort of economic or social progress, but rather hate. The lie that people are somehow ethnically or religiously superior to others, but that is not concrete at all. I mean, rather than solving problems, they not only create new problems, but they lie about them. Somehow you should be better, you are great again as a superior ethnic or racial being, and yet nothing changes. So, and I agree with Hannah that this is not about changing the status quo, this is about, just a different form of politics that doesn't increase in any way democracy. I mean, Mussolini will say, "I'm against." I should stop. Okay.
I will return to that. Sentence.
Yeah, no, I'm okay.
I'm not that strict.
I'm
What
okay.
did Mussolini say?
Mussolini said that. I mean, this is interesting. That it is a problem, and we see this in neoliberalism and also in in communism, that there is overdetermination of material interpretations, right? So everything is about economics. Now, Mussolini was against that to the extent that he posed the opposite. This is about the primacy of politics, about me saying what we should do. And he actually said, I am against homo economicus. But then his own proposal doesn't change the economy at all. Actually, it kept the status quo as it was.
Thank you. We're running out of time, unfortunately. It's a very interesting discussion, but we need to close it off. Before we go to the applause for our speakers, I would kindly ask you, if you have a little bit of time, could you please scan this QR code and tell us what you thought of this evening? So you can leave some feedback for us, for the speakers, things you liked, things that you would like to have seen differently the next time. We really appreciate that. Also, I wanted to draw your attention. Next week on Monday, we also have an English spoken lecture about Ukraine. What do we know about Russia's war against Ukraine? Which might also be interested for the audience here. So if you like, please come to that evening as well. Then, most importantly, I want to give a big thank you and applause for both of our speakers, Professor Federico Finchelstein and Hannah McHugh.
Thank you.